record on this computer. Awesome. All right, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to share my guests and their stories with you guys today. Today we have three incredible women here just to help you guys understand a little bit more about disenfranchised grief, how to support it, how to recognize it, and really just kind of from their own experiences let you know all of the different types of ways that people can feel disenfranchised in their grief process. So if you would, please take a second, ladies, and introduce yourself to our attendees. We'll start with Becca.
Hi, I'm Becca, and today I'll be talking about my sister.
Thank you. Jessica?
My name is Jessica, and I will be talking about my infertility and my miscarriages.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jackie, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about pet loss and also my grandfather.
Thank you. So we know that this topic can be really uncomfortable for a lot of clinicians to address. And so what we hope to do is really normalize the experience and kind of point out ways that we can help clients of ours recognize when they're struggling with disenfranchised grief, but also we really hope to teach you from their stories, very simple, gentle ways to help them recognize and honor their grief and loss experience. So that way they don't feel so disenfranchised in this process. So we're going to start with Becca's story, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask you a few questions and just go ahead and just tell the audience a little bit about your story through these questions. So the first question is, you mentioned that your sister died. Can you tell us a little bit more about how she died?
Yes, so my sister died from a carbon monoxide incident. She had her car parked in her townhome, so her garage was under her apartment, and essentially she had a self-starter, and the car was either left on or the starter was left on, and the carbon monoxide seeped up through her apartment and killed her and her puppy.
Thanks for sharing that. At what point in your grief process did you become aware that maybe you were experiencing a little bit of disenfranchisement in your grief process?
I was 17 and I have an older brother. My sister that I'm speaking of, she was my half sister. So we had the same father, but a different mother. And on her mother's side, she also had two siblings. Her mother quickly planned the funeral across the country in a way that hopefully in her mind we wouldn't be able to make it. And then once we made it, she had left our names out of the obituary. And on top of that, at my sister's graveside, there's a bench with her other sibling's name on it. And it didn't take long to realize that my brother and I were not validated in this process.
So from that experience, you've honed in on one of the categories of how we identify that grief is disenfranchised, which is not only were you like removed from your ability to participate in any like closing ritual or ceremony, but you were also removed in the aspects of honoring your loved one. Can you describe what grief kind of looked and felt like in those moments when you were feeling excluded or like your grief didn't have a place?
In that moment, it was a collective disenfranchisement. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it was my entire dad's side of the family that had made an effort to be at the funeral, that had made an effort to honor my sister, but all of us were recognizing quickly that our names were left out and our pictures were left out of the slideshow. So there was this collective opportunity to try and sort of make our voices heard or sort of make ourselves feel validated within each other. But it was really hard, and you could tell there was this heaviness for every single person that was there that was feeling that disenfranchisement. So it wasn't just me, but every single person on my dad's side that shared a last name with my sister somehow was left out.
Mm-hmm. And in those, can you touch upon like certain feelings or emotions that came up for you in terms of those experiences?
I think the first one that pops in my mind is jealousy for my sister's other sister that she had no relationship with, that she wasn't close with at all, quite honestly had nothing good to say about. But this person had been elevated and highlighted and was recognized multiple times. And I was so envious that everyone was so apologetic and so sad for her grief, and somehow mine was dismissed. So on top of jealousy, there was resentment and anger towards the people whom I knew were responsible at that moment. I felt forgotten and just alone. And like, on top of all of that all I wanted was my sister to validate all of those things for me.
Thank you for sharing that. So in those moments when you're not able to participate in something that you could contribute to, like a closing ritual, an ending of life ceremony, going to the graveside, and it be a place of your choosing or a place where you can easily access, in what ways did you find the ability to honor and recognize your sister's loss? So did you create your own rituals, your own ceremonies, your own ways to maintain a connection, or even just the essence of saying goodbye?
I began leaving a lot of messages on her voicemail, trying to somehow say goodbye. I would write letters and I would burn them in hopes that they would reach her. And then after about a year, when I was old enough, my brother and I got matching tattoos in her honor. And that felt like the final way to sort of honor her amongst our family.
Thank you for that. And did you find that you were able to get support when the death happened? Was there lack of support that you felt, or in which ways did you kind of find support through this feeling of disenfranchisement?
There's almost a certain air of embarrassment that comes along with this type of grief, or with this. We had gone across the country to go to her funeral, and then we came home and I have all of my friends trying to be there for me, and it's so hard to explain to them that we weren't even allowed to really participate. So I don't know how to, could you not to
Yeah, more so like where did you seek support? How did you find it? Did you find it, or did it feel like for this particular loss you struggled with finding the appropriate support or adequate support?
I definitely struggled with finding the appropriate or adequate support. My family was all really there for each other, but it really felt like we were trying really hard to be there mostly for my father. And we were trying to kind of put all of our energy into that. And then it wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to really start finding that support. It wasn't until I was a facilitator at a grief group that I was really able to kind of recognize that it was a very real process for me.
So for you, doing grief work around your sister's loss sounds like it came many years later.
Yeah, it did.
So we have this opportunity in front of you to like speak to professionals about what is helpful. What is helpful if a griever is sitting right in front of you and they've experienced disenfranchised grief. Their grief has not been supported, acknowledged. They have been robbed of opportunities to participate in these end-of-life rituals that are so meaningful. How could a therapist or a clinician or a peer support person, a friend or a family member, how could they show up for you and support you? What would you say would be the best way to companion you, if you will, on this journey of healing?
I think the best way would be to let me tell my story from start to finish, from how I found out to what ended up occurring at the funeral and the graveside. I think the best thing somebody could do is be brave and recognize that the answers may not be cliche and they may not be typical or what other people may experience, that this sort of disenfranchisement comes with a lot of heavier questions that may not ever get answered. And so I think just somebody who is willing to roll up their sleeves and ask me the hard questions and create a safe space where it wasn't embarrassing, or it would be safe to talk about the jealousy that I felt for somebody else, even when I was talking about the hardest loss I'd experienced up to that point.
And if so, it sounds like you're saying a clinician can really like give you permission to tell your story without feeling ashamed or judged in any way. So like recognizing that your truth is your truth, regardless of any contingencies around who it was or how they died. And then also it sounds like giving you the opportunity to still tell your story from start to finish, uninterrupted, without judgment. Is there anything else that sticks out to you before we close with your story?
I think something that really sticks out is that there can be disenfranchisement on all levels. So you can experience it within your immediate family, you can experience it within extended family, and then also systemically within the way she died. So carbon monoxide being such a foreign concept to a lot of people, and so there being sort of this stigma or this idea around why it could have happened, or all of that, recognizing that it happens on many levels as opposed to just one particular identifiable emotion.
And if you don't mind me sharing, I know Becca personally, obviously, that's why she's here. So I also know that she has a long history of loss in her past. A lot of them being death of people, but also non-death related losses. And so for you, I know one of our fairly recent conversation was all about like, man, I just never realized how many of my losses were disenfranchised until I really sat down and looked at them. Is there anything else that came up for you when you had that like epiphany that, wow, there's so many aspects of my entire life up to this date that has been disenfranchised?
It was a pretty eye-opening moment at that point when I was really researching what disenfranchised grief was, and there was a list of maybe ways that it could be, maybe opportunities where your grief could be disenfranchised, like suicide loss or a drug overdose or somebody who was murdered or somebody who is a member of a gang on any level, and recognizing that I was circling so many of these items on this list and recognizing that there were so many places where I felt invalidated, or so many places where somebody could really look at this type of grief and see that it's not normal, even though there's really no normal way to grieve. But I think it's really important to recognize that there are lots of areas where disenfranchisement could show up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Becca. Yep. So I'm going to move on to Jessica. And Jessica, I want to thank you for being here. You are also somebody that I really love and admire personally, and know have gone through quite a bit yourself. So you had mentioned that today you're going to be talking about some loss around infertility and miscarriage. And so I thank you for opening up and sharing about those types of losses. And I want to start out with a very similar question. Can you tell us a little bit about what came up for you as you were experiencing these particular types of loss?
Yeah, the order of how it's all intertwined, right? Disenfranchised grief it's infertility has its own little bullet point, and miscarriages too. For a lot of those people who are struggling, some of those are intertwined. So I actually, the first time I ever got pregnant, I didn't know that there were infertility issues at all. So for myself, I wasn't struggling at that point. I was just like in this midst of joy. We were going through this process. And the idea of that 12 weeks, that's where things could happen, I knew about it, but it just felt like that wasn't going to be me. And so I remember on the 11th week when we went for the ultrasound, the technician left, came back, told us that there was no heartbeat. And that was my first heavy drop. The first time we knew that like this can actually happen to us. And I think for that, you know, in that moment, it really was the idea of like, you build a lot of hopes and dreams in that moment. And it's unrecognizable to a lot of people on the outside because they haven't met that person you're dreaming about yet. But you know, and especially for carrying the child, it messes with a lot with like your abilities and things like that. As time went on, we weren't able to get pregnant, and we noticed we were having some struggles about like a year into it. And actually, it was my husband who finally got tested because all my tests were coming back positive. And we found out that he was actually the one that was struggling with our infertility issues, which created a whole different layer of me understanding how our infertility, you know, there was a whole part I didn't understand how it was affecting him. And as me being the one that would be pregnant, how it was going to affect me. So we struggled through that together. And then I had another miscarriage. And then I actually got pregnant with my twins, boy and a girl. And then I had a mixed carriage after that, which had a whole different layer of what it looked like. So it's been a roller coaster, but that has pretty much been the timeline of our stuff. But you know, we always still live in our infertility and the struggle of having a family.
And can you talk a little bit about like some of the thoughts or the emotions that come up for you as somebody who's struggled with infertility first, maybe some thoughts and feelings that came up for you then, and then move on to the thoughts and feelings that come up for you after a miscarriage?
Yeah, with infertility, I think there's just want to know what's wrong, you know, why something isn't working, because when you're living in that unknown, that's uncomfortable. And that feeling of, you know, once we can pinpoint the issue, we'll feel better. And it's a fog. It's not real. That's not an actual, it doesn't make you feel better once you know the reason, especially if the reason's concrete, that you're going to struggle. So I think when it came to that, the moment your infertility kind of comes out, and you know, one, you have to like reconcile that between you and your partner, you know, of what that looks like, you know, and as a couple. But then also, how do you share that, because it's such a personal loss in itself, just not to have the quote unquote normal process. You know, your process is going to look different. So you know, one of the things that started happening is people would, you know, all of a sudden go into fix it. Like, have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done this? And I could understand that they were trying to get us to that end goal of having a child, but we were still grieving the process that we don't get to have a normal pregnancy. We don't get to do this without 6 other people being involved. It's just not the 2 that it's meant to be. It's different. And I think that goes for even a lot of people, a lot of couples. But that was something that we struggled with.
And if you could identify like any like feelings that pop up to you immediately when you think about like infertility, when maybe you thought you were the reason why the infertility was taking place, like what were some of the immediate thoughts or feelings that jumped out at you?
Oh, shame. You go down that shame spiral of, what did I do wrong? What did I eat, not eat? You know, did I not take care of myself? Your mind races to like 8 years ago when you did something and jumped off something, or, you know, drank too much one night, and you wonder like, was that it? Was that the point of where I messed my body up and I can't do this anymore? So you definitely go through a shame, you know, you go through frustration. I think a big part is there's anger, and you don't really know where to direct that anger, because you are again dealing with a bunch of unknown questions. And then there is just like a deep sadness, and I think that sadness and that frustration can like intertwine, because usually you have a partner in this, and whoever is deciding to be the one that's pregnant, you know, and speaking of, you know, same sex and, you know, and hetero couples, that person is now like looking at their body, but also that person is struggling with what it means to support. And so sometimes even in it together, you're still not having the same experience. And I mean, and that's all grief, right? But I think that was something that we realized we were coming into frustrations and arguments, and we were like, we're in this together, right? But how come we can't see the eye to eye? Why are we fighting? Why can't you understand how I feel? And sometimes it's taking a step back and really looking at the other's perspective.
And in that same space, can you share for us a little of the thoughts or the feelings in the grief world that come up when you miscarried, when you were told that you were pregnant, you were growing, you know, this human, and then the growth stopped, and then how did it feel? What were the thoughts and feelings going through you then? Were they similar to the infertility in some ways, or dramatically different in some ways?
You know, I feel like it was definitely different, because with each of the miscarriages, it just always felt different. You have a different set of hopes set aside, this time scripted in your head of this is how it's going to go. The thoughts around my first miscarriage, we went in there super hopeful, you know what I mean? Like, you know, everything's going to be fine. We're going to hear a heartbeat, and you're really in this giddy place. And that first time it happened, there was this really deep-seated disbelief that the picture we just saw was our child not moving. The picture that we saw is the last one we'll have. The idea that November's due date is coming is actually not coming anymore. And so there was this reality that hit, along with the idea that what a lot of people forget is once you find out you have a miscarriage, that's not the end. You know, there's still this whole process of, you know, having to remove what's inside of you. And so it just gets even more ingrained because you have to like live through that process of it being also pulled from you. So that was torture for me and my husband, for him to watch and know he couldn't help me, and for me to go through knowing that this is something that I have to watch leave me, while I was already feeling the gut-wrenching feeling of it, you know, leaving all the hopes and dreams. You know, the second and the third time it happened, you know, you just, after the first one, you always go into, for myself, you go into these situations now scared. You know, every ultrasound all the way up until the end, you're just scared. You just don't know. You become very sure that there's just no guarantee. So it's a struggle to be hopeful during your pregnancy when you know that there's an outcome and no one's safe from that outcome. So I think that started to really set in, and then you feel robbed of the joy when you are having a successful pregnancy. Things are going well, and you don't want to, you want, like, I want to relish in all this joy, but at the same time, I don't want to be surprised. So I'm going to wait for the foot to drop. And then you are robbing yourself of the joy. So what do you do?
It's such a good point. I know that, you know, in our world, we typically don't have a lot of ceremony or ritual around miscarriages. It's oftentimes, I think that, you know, we're starting to turn a corner and we're starting to advocate a little bit more for it now that we're becoming so much more aware of the grief process that's tied to miscarriages. When you were going through that process, did you feel like ritual or ceremony was needed? Did you have access to it? Was it something that you did on your own? What did that look like?
You know, I think it wasn't until I kind of really stepped back and realized like how deeply I was affected. Because, you know, in those moments, you're kind of just looking for answers, and you're in this, for some who continue to pursue it, like that process of, well, now what do I do in order to have a child? I didn't realize that I needed a lot of healing from what I went through. And it took me a while to really learn that there was something I was missing within myself. And it actually happened when that November that came from my first miscarriage, I had eagerly signed up for some like newborn baby stuff, and you enter your due date. And November came, and I opened my front door, and there sitting on my doorstep is a thing of formula saying, "Congratulations, your baby's here." And I remember like looking at that package and being like, oh man, like if I thought I could just let this slide, now I can't. And I had the worst month ever. So I think when I realized all the things that I was looking forward to, that was when I realized I had really had to do some work and really look at things. So it wasn't until later I actually started to realize that I needed some healing and some rituals and some anniversaries and acknowledgement, because it's something that other people don't know how to acknowledge, because it's someone they've never met. It happened actually spontaneously. We went to one of those lantern ceremonies where they go up into the air and you can draw, and everyone can draw on their bag and write random stuff. And when we got our bag, all of a sudden I found myself writing the names of what I was planning on naming my children on that bag. And so that became something that was really meaningful. Also, with October 15 being like pregnancy loss and miscarriage and stillbirth day, I really take a lot into honor it, because it's also the eve of my birthday. So I really always take a moment to like light my candle in my windowsill, really acknowledge the pregnancies I've lost, the kids I didn't get to have. As well as I took the route St. Becca's talking about. I have a tattoo on my rib cage of a needle and thread about, we scar, but we can put ourselves back together, but there's always a scar, and there's always a remembrance, and it's not the same. So those are the things that I've done for myself that were very personal, that didn't really include a lot of people, because it's hard for people to connect to this type of loss.
And I appreciate you sharing that, because what you're getting at is that, it's almost like if anybody dies after they're born, right, it's automatically expected that you would have a funeral, there would be a burial or a cremation, or however you choose to close a life in your culture or your personal life, right? But that tends to not be the standard with a miscarriage. And wouldn't it be so much more inclusive, right, to go out of your way to have some formal, funeral of some sort, or recognizing or honoring after a miscarriage happens? It would feel less disenfranchised, right? Because there is this ceremonial aspect to it. And yet for whatever reason, the standard isn't there.
Yeah. And I think there's this idea that we forget, in what we know as professionals, to ask the griever, right? We forget to just ask the griever of what would you want to do to honor? And that varies from person to person who's going through that struggle. But we forget to ask someone in that space the same question. There tends to be, from my experience, a jump to the fix. Well, how do we fix this? How do we get you to your point, your end point? And so the acknowledgement that, people need to have something for themselves, whether it's personal or with others, but you only find that out by asking. And I think that's the thing about disenfranchised grief, is that people don't know how to ask, or even know that there is a question to ask.
So true. And speaking of support, after, it sounds like you also mentioned that it took you a while to recognize that maybe you needed some support. And I feel like that is a theme with disenfranchised grief. People tend to not get support right away, but it's not until later that they recognize that, oh, wait a minute, like this isn't budging, this isn't moving. Actually, it's getting heavier to bear and carry. I better go and figure out a way to handle this, or get support through it. So did you pick up any outside support? Did you find it amongst your family and friends? Did you find it challenging to get support or adequate support during your all three of your miscarriages?
I think what actually ended up helping me is being the ability to, I just didn't shy away from it, because it was so painful when I didn't know who I could talk about it with, is I talked about it the way I would talk about when my friend died from suicide, the same I talk about when my grandfather died from cancer. I started to include it in my grief story, as opposed to this sub-subject that we would talk about, because, it's different. So I became just very vocal in a way of an advocacy that this is something that's real. And a lot of women walk around painful, and men, that walk around with this pain of what they're going through. So for me, that was something that I did to really put it forward. I also did end up, seeking more first, exploring my spirituality is what I needed there. And then also I did go do therapy. So I I went every route. I was like, okay, I feel something broken that's not getting its wounds licked. What do I do? And, I think that's something to think about, is putting your eggs in any one basket can feel like at one point it's going to disappoint you. But if you kind of put your hands in all those reaches, from being vocal about your support to professional help to the reflective and internal work, that's what I found helped me.
Mm. So, and my last thing is, again, you have this opportunity to speak directly to clinicians about ways that they can encourage and support grievers that are sitting in front of them. What do you think a takeaway for them should be? What should be at the forefront of their practice when they're trying to connect and support somebody who's grieving?
The biggest thing is slow down and just let it sit in exactly where they're at, and stay present and validate. Because I think, speaking from the specific one on, miscarriages and infertility, it's so easy, and even with any disenfranchised griever, to move to hope, and to move to that light space, because that's what we want people to, find on their own, and in their own time, but really let them sit in what that is for them. And I think maybe even something specific for, miscarriages and infertility to be aware of is that when that happens, when that person may have the ability to have a child, whether it's through adoption or through a successful IVF, or maybe by the miracle, she was able to get pregnant. Having a baby doesn't wash away the miscarriages. It doesn't all of a sudden be like, got one, those miscarriages still live. There's still something that they'll grieve forever. And the infertility is something that lives long in the middle of that child being born. So I think there's a moment where that needs to be recognized, that it's not a box that's, can be filled, as much as it needs to be honored amongst that entire story.
So sounds like one of the ways that a therapist or a clinician can really help a griever is helping them identify ways to continue a bond with the life forms that weren't able to come into an existence, but also ways to honor them, preserve what was, and move it forward with them in any way possible, whatever that griever feels like is a good fit for them, but really helping them find ways and giving permission to keep those memories and those experiences like alive.
Yeah, definitely. And also being just aware of that each miscarriage may be honored in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I will quickly give that story. Like, my miscarriage that I had after my twins was part of the embryos, because I went through IVF, that was in their set. And so I knew that it was a boy, and I named it right from the get-go, because I was like, oh, this is my kid's twin, would have been the triplet. I'm gonna name him already. And so because I had sat with 2 years with this named child, it was such a different process. So I have a different memorial and different story that I write to honor him, as opposed to my first two. And all of them are, important, but I didn't go through the same process for each of them. Mm-hmm. And that's something to be aware of too.
And almost the relationship, right? The relationship is totally different, even though the outcome is similar.
Yes.
Anything else before I move to Jackie?
No, thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. All right, Jackie, you are next, and thank you for patiently holding space with us here. So you mentioned in your opening that you're going to talk a little bit about pet loss and the loss of a grandparent. So can you walk us a little bit through your experience with both?
Sure. So my grandpa died in 2009, and so it's been 11 years. And he was, I didn't have a relationship with his son, which is my father. And so he became the father figure in my life. So it was like my mom was a single mom, and then I would be, at my grandparents' house during the day. And so most of my childhood memories include my mom and then my granny and grandpa. And so it was a big, it was hard because I first had to take care of him for about 2 years. I moved in with him, and then he died. And we knew it was coming. It was, a stroke. But I felt that was kind of, it was a huge eye-opening thing for me, because I had experienced loss with, as far as my grandmother, but I never processed it ever. I mean, she died in 2003, and so when I processed my grandfather, I also had to process my grandmother as well, because I was 16 when she died, and I didn't have any support. And then luckily I did have support with my grandfather, but it was it was almost like grieving two in one, essentially. And then the pet loss was in 2017. It was the first two dogs that my wife and I got together when we first got together. So it was, a long time ago. We've been married for a long time. And so that was our first thing that we had together. I mean, we don't have kids. We've chosen not to have kids right now for various reasons that I prefer not to talk about here. But it was one of those things that we knew was coming, obviously, because a dog's life has a certain lifespan. But it was one of those things that once you experience grief, you're definitely afraid to experience it again. And when you hear it again, you're like, okay, let's do this. And so it was really hard, because you have a house filled with love and caring and snuggles and puppy kisses, and then one day one of them's not there, and it's like, and they were the two that we had were very close, and very close together. They died 6 months apart, and so it was one of those things that we had three, and then within 6 months we only had one. And so our house was vastly different. It was like you could hear a pin drop, and it was just on a daily basis was really hard. And so luckily I had some tools coming from my grandfather's loss, but it doesn't get easier. And a lot of people choose not to have children. A lot of people go through, a couple of my friends go through infertility, like Jessica went through, and chose, I can't do it. I just can't. I'm just going to have puppies or cats or whatever they have, turtles, I don't know. And so it's important to acknowledge that grief for me as a grief and as a part of my family, instead of just a pet or just a dog.
And I think that's what makes pet loss so disenfranchising too, is that we put the word just in front of it. And when you put the word just in front of any loss, it can really negate or dismiss a relationship, a bond, a connection, moments, experiences, everything that goes into relationships and connections and stuff. And that's what makes disenfranchised grief so challenging, is that it can make somebody feel like, I don't know if I can sit there and be this sad over a dog death, for a long period of time, or this sad over a grandpa death for a long period of time, because it's just a dog or it's just a grandparent. And have you felt like that personally, Jackie? Has like those thoughts kind of, or those narrations ever creeped into your head?
Well, as far as my grandfather, people who don't know me, yes, it was very, oh, that was just your grandfather. Oh, okay. Okay. No. But for people that know me, I think that they knew the effect that it had on me because of my lack of relationship with my father. And so it was such a profound loss within my life, because that was the person who raised me, who helped raise me. And as far as, my puppies, yeah, I felt like dismissed. I felt like my grief didn't matter. I felt like I felt embarrassed to talk about it. Like I had to justify Like, oh, I don't have kids, so, but I have dogs. And, you know, they're like, you shouldn't have to justify that.
And it's such a strong, powerful word. I think that's one of the words that when I'm looking for disenfranchised grief in somebody, I'm looking, does this person feel like they need to justify the relationship or why they died or how they died or who died in their life? And so I appreciate you bringing that up. Can you talk a little bit about some thoughts or feelings that are associated with either of those deaths? And you're probably, the audience is probably laughing why we both had a huge grin when we're asking her to talk about this. And it's because Jackie has a long history of not wanting to do feelings. And so,
Yeah.
But I think we're in a place now where she might be able to identify and share some of those with us today.
Yes, I was born in 1984, and in 2009 I realized what feelings were called. And so I realized that. So yeah, I think the first one about my grandfather was anger and loss. Like, just, I was lost. Like, I didn't know who I was without him. I didn't know how to live life without him. I didn't know, I mean, just every question that I had, he would answer. So I didn't know what to do. It was almost like just kind of wandering around trying to figure life out. So, I mean, I had a lot of guilt as well. Guilt was a huge thing. I don't know if it's Catholic guilt or just regular guilt. But it was a big thing for me was to, you know, to get over that, with things surrounding that. I was jealous of other people who had grandparents. I was just insanely sad, and I couldn't, and my first go-to reaction, which I learned later in therapy is not a good one to go to, but it's anger. So I automatically just pop off and I'm angry about stuff until I realize and kind of process. I'm getting better, but you know, it happens. And then with my pet, it was just like this gut feeling of like being punched in the gut, and I couldn't figure out, like, I couldn't breathe. You know, when, like, you know, you're in the room, you know, and you're just, they're there and then they're not. And it's just like you walk out and you have to hold their leash, and they're, you know, they want you to pay, and there's all this other stuff that you have to do, and you're just like, whatever, like, just, I don't know, I can't even breathe right now. Like, I'm sobbing and I can't breathe. And so it's just, I think, just sadness was the biggest thing.
And did you find ways to participate in any ceremonial or ritual for either losses?
For my grandfather, I luckily was involved in this camp. So we would go up and we would release balloons into the air. And that was a big thing for me. That was something that really completed and was ceremonious for me, particularly. And then, I mean, in my house, I still have pictures of him. I have his favorite wooden statue that I'll have until the day that I die, because I can't get rid of it, that I kind of talk to and, you know, just chat. I know it's kind of weird, but, you know, it is what it is. And it's just one of those, for my puppies, I made a shadow box with their little paw print and then my favorite picture of them. So that's also hanging in my house. And I think that for me, it's soothing to have those types of things that are right there in front of me, because it allows me to process the grief and process the feelings when they come up, versus shoving them down and putting them in a closet or putting them in a box or something like that, which I grew really accustomed to before I went through bereavement and therapy. So I think that it's important for me to see it up front and to be up front and center, so that I can feel comfort, as well as during times like in 5 days, it's his birthday. And so I have to wish him a happy birthday, and we'll maybe sing something, or maybe we'll release a balloon or something like that. And funny story is also my other puppy, since the other two died, which it took me 2 years to get a new puppy. It's her birthday. It's her first birthday. So it's just on his birthday, which is the craziest thing. And so how it all works out, I don't think he's ever going to leave me. I'm pretty sure.
So you shared both like a death, but then also I'm wondering if any of you really, well, first let me ask you this. Do you have any like pointers or recommendations, suggestions for how a therapist could, support somebody who may be experiencing disenfranchised grief?
I think that the main thing for friends, family, therapist is, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that you should minimize it and dismiss it. And just because you don't think, or you think 2 weeks after their pet has died that they're totally fine, they're a total mess. And just because 11 years later, you should have grieved that time, during that time, it never goes away. And so follow up with those people, follow up, and know that it's not just within the initial X amount of time frame that you believe is written in the book that should tell you that. It's that follow up and say, check in with your family, check in with your friends, check in with your patients, or, schedule an appointment. I don't know how it works, but, just, it doesn't go away. And sometimes during the hard days or the hard months, it's worse. And, it's not just magically going to go away with time. It gets easier, but it doesn't go away.
From either of your guys' opinion, would it be safe to say that it could benefit a therapist when somebody's coming in or a clinician when somebody's coming in with some other issue, some other problem, some other challenge that they're facing or going through? Is there benefit in asking if there's been any, grief that has come up for them recently that could potentially be a complicated factor, another layer, or something that is catapulting and making this challenge bigger? Do you see would there be benefit in that, do you think?
I think that there is definitely benefit in that, because quite often when dealing with grief of any kind, you're not always aware that that's what's happening. So like Jackie was saying, her first instinct is to pop off, is she gets angry. And I too, I know, also not a very healthy way of dealing with it, but that's my first instinct. And I think sometimes if I'm extra angry or extra emotional in any way, shape, or form, if I can make that connection that, oh yeah, this is the month my sister died, or oh yeah, this is her birthday, or this is what's going on. Maybe there's this connection that's happening that we aren't able to make by ourselves. So if a clinician is maybe able to help their client sort of come to that conclusion, it might help validate all of these feelings that are coming up, even when you don't necessarily know why they are.
Right. Yes, Jackie.
I absolutely agree with that, because so he died August 21st, and literally I can time it and I don't even realize it. It's just maybe subconscious, or I'm not really sure, but I get all discombobulated. I'm like, is Mercury gone? Like, what is happening in this world right now? Because by like July, the second week of July, going into August, it's like I'm just a complete mess. I can't focus. I'm all angry. I pop off really easy, and then I'm sad. I'm like, what is happening? And it usually takes me to look at the date, or to look at that, or to have somebody say, hey, what time of the year is it? For me to go, oh yeah, okay. So just to, really check in and write those things down, because those matter to the people that you're helping to grieve. If you know that, and if you have written those down, or just taken note of, hey, around this time they go bonkers.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is more like reiterating it in the way, I feel like saying it 3 different ways because of how important this is. But, the idea is that, the reason it's disenfranchised grief is because as a society and as a culture, we already told like how it's just a pet, or, grandfather is a distant or a miscarriage, or, people make assumptions about your relationships or what it is that we unknowingly, sometimes subconsciously do it to ourselves. We don't know that that's coming up for us. So I think a valuable piece for a therapist is when those pieces of disenfranchised grief come up, to be very comfortable with asking those around dates that have been reflected in your past sessions, is not to be afraid to go there, not to be afraid to ask, because we might be going through turmoil and we would have no idea of the connection until we are already deep in it, up to our necks in it, and drowning. And I think I realized that after my third November that I did not like November very much because of how many things. My failed IVF also happened in that era. So and in that time. So I think that's something to think about, as far as just being aware that your person may not even know that they're going. Your client may not know.
So we have a toddler joining us, and we're actually going to wrap up soon.
Guest.
We have a special guest. Yes, we're going to wrap up soon, but I wanted to just give you guys each one more opportunity just to say anything about disenfranchised grief, anything about grief in general, anything about like just something that you have found to be very supportive, very valuable to you in your journey that has led you to the place where you are today in your healing process.
I think it's so important to validate that person's grief. And I know we've said this 100 ways, but with disenfranchisement, the person may not be getting validation from their family, from their partner, maybe not even from themselves. And you, as a clinician, you may be the only person that makes them feel like their story matters, like their story affects more than just them. And I think that just be brave, go there with them, make sure that they understand that it's more than just anything.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say, just to add to that, just go in like you don't know anything. A lot of times we go as professionals, because we learn and we have this educational background, that we're trying to sit there and make the connections and what this could possibly mean. Go in with a blank slate and realize that this is an unknown story in an unknown territory, with all thoughts and feelings, and a path that is foreign to you, and realize that they're the only ones that can tell you how deep their grief is. Because the moment you assign a level of importance, a number, a validation amongst your own, thought process, you've lost them. And you have to take so much more to get it back. So if you hear someone talking and for some reason it's not making a connection why that's important, it doesn't matter. Just keep going and stay with them, because some of the things that they're talking about, because it's so recognized as disenfranchised grief and grief in general, that if they're giving you an inkling, they're sharing, and there's a chance they'll share more. So just go in pretending that you're not a professional, you're just a listener, and you just want to know their story.
Or you're a professional listener.
I think that from somebody who had zero therapy background prior to a significant loss, I think a lot of people in this country or society, or whatever you want to put it, don't put any value on grief and just dismiss it and just go for it and just, move through it. Or and I think that if you take the time to challenge them, I was extremely challenged when I was going through my bereavement and therapy, and it helped because I didn't know any better. Like, I don't come from any sort of, therapy background or anything. I come from a totally different background, and I'm just a patient or a client, or however you want to put it. And I think that if you challenge them to see how big grief is, and give them tools, because so many people just minimize grief in general And then you have all of these subcategories that then completely get just pushed off to the side, that it's so important to value grief and how it affects every single aspect of your life. And I think that's the biggest thing that I have taken away from my experience with grief and therapy, and then, you know, then giving back to grieving kids and all of that as a volunteer. It was, you know, I see you and I hear you, but let's talk about this. Let's go a little bit deeper, and let me challenge you a little bit, because that, I feel like that was so important, to see and to show the big picture about, if you're mad at your teacher, you're probably not mad at your teacher. You're probably mad at your person, or you're mad and you're sad and you can't really validate those feelings, and you can't figure out why there's all this craziness going on in your body. And I think that that's an important thing to take away.
Thank you. And I think the one thing I want to highlight here too is one of the things that all three of you guys have in common is, after your loss, you found a way to give back to the grief community. And all three of you have happened to help in combination, either grieving adults or grieving children in some capacity or another. And I wonder if helping and giving back as being part of your healing journey helped illuminate anything for you in your grief process, as just a final takeaway or thought of why it's so powerful in the healing journey to be able to connect with a like community.
I'll go first. I absolutely think so. I think that if I didn't give back, and if I didn't go to camp for as many years as I did, and also do weekly groups, that I would not have come this far. I feel like I would have been halted at where I stopped my therapy. And because when you give back, and when you see grief through other people's eyes in different ways, it helps you to fix whatever and kind of put the pieces back together, but arranged in a different way, I guess, is the only way that I can think of. But also it helped me to be okay with talking about it to random strangers that I never know. And how many people might see this, I'm not sure. It makes me uncomfortable, but I'm rolling with it. And, you know, it's one of those things that you step outside of your comfort zone when you give back, and you are able to then tell your story in a different way. But also you can hear people, and you can see them in a different way, and you can actually hear them and validate their feelings because you felt those feelings in some capacity.
Yeah, I think for me, what I realized when I started becoming involved in volunteering and being in the community was that, you know, we unknowingly are going through our own feeling of isolation, because, you know, and I think that that's, you know, arguably all grief, because we're grieving that very specific relationship to us. So when you are going through that, it's so easy to sit in your thoughts and feelings and not have that. But if you find a community, a support, a place to volunteer, it brings you to a space where like that pain is more highlighted and more talked about and not shied away from. And it really does help normalize in a way where I'm not broken, and, you know, and if I am broken, it's okay, because we're all broken. So I think when I found that tribe, that we can all be there in that pain, and we can laugh in our pain and still have the pain, it really does a lot of sense of making you still feel human and still have value, and know that you can still give and take away from someone else. So I think that that's something to be highlighted of maybe just not being aware that you might need it as much as you're thinking of what you can give back, is that there's a sense of you, that there's an interchange of energy that can happen.
Ooh, I like that interchange of energy. I completely agree with that. I have experienced, like Melissa had mentioned, a lot of loss in a lot of different areas in my life. My sister sort of started all of it. It was my sister, and then it was my dad, and then it was uncles and all of my grandparents. And countless friends. I think I'm like over 40 at this point. And there's something that it's so crazy to me because I never thought that I would be getting into grief and loss. That was never my idea. That was never my plan. And there's this interesting feeling that my ancestors now have this push towards helping other people who've experienced very similar things, whether it is a parent loss, sibling loss, friend loss, family member loss of any level. And this word that pops out to me is legacy. And it's this way that I can sort of carry on what they have always believed in me to be able to do. There's this sense of me, that ultimate way of honoring them is to be able to give back. And it's awesome.
Well, I can't thank you guys enough for your time and sharing your story and aspects, and I really of the ways that you've been, disenfranchised over the certain aspects of grief. We didn't touch too much on non-loss or non-death loss, but I know that we've experienced quite a lot of that with incarceration and divorce and all sorts of things, Alzheimer's, stroke, traumatic brain injuries, you name it. These are all other significant losses that people can experience and go through. And also so deserving of space and validation and the opportunity to not only have a ritual or a closing about it, but also a way to honor and preserve what that meant to you when it was in your possession or around you in your life, and what it looks like to move forward and finding your tribe and your support system. So thank you so much for all of your time today. And we hope that our attendees have learned something new and valuable from your stories. I'm just gonna